Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today, we're examining one of America's oldest missing child cases. A summer concert, thousands of people, and a little girl who simply vanished into the crowd.
It is honestly the ultimate locked room mystery. Except, the room is this wide open park and the locks are just the eyes of 1,000 bystanders.
Yeah. And I want to put you, the listener, right in the middle of that exact paradox right off the bat. Because, imagine standing in a massive park. There are 1,500 people pressing in around you. That is 3,000 eyes, right?
Right.
3,000 potential witnesses. And the sheer volume of humanity there makes you feel, inherently secure. We are wired to believe that there is safety in numbers.
Oh, absolutely. It's an evolutionary instinct.
Exactly. And yet today, we're exploring a moment where a 10-year-old child evaporates from that exact setting without a single person raising an alarm. How does a crowd that massive fail to see a child being taken?
Well, it forces us to confront a really unsettling reality about human perception. Because a massive crowd does not equal a massive surveillance network. Think of a densely packed crowd moving in the dark, like a massive school of fish.
Okay, a school of fish.
Right. When a school of fish moves, the individual fish aren't looking at the entire ecosystem. They are hyper-focused only on the fish immediately to their left, their right, right in front of them, just trying not to collide.
So they're just managing their immediate bubble.
Exactly. When 1,500 people are exiting a dark park, navigating uneven grass, looking for their cars, gathering their own tired kids, they suffer from profound inattentional blindness. They are not looking for a predator.
And a predator knows this.
100%. A crowd doesn't expose a hunter. A crowd provides the perfect chaotic camouflage.
Which completely shatters our basic assumptions about public safety, honestly. And to truly understand the mechanics of how this camouflage was exploited on the evening of August 24th, 1951, we are traveling to Cleveland, Ohio.
A fascinating place, and time for this to happen too.
Yeah, it really is. We are going to walk through the timeline, untangle decades of just bizarre false leads, and analyze how this single night forever altered the American perception of the suburban neighborhood. But we cannot analyze the crime without first understanding who the victim was.
Yeah, victimology is the absolute foundation of this investigation. If we don't understand her baseline behavior, we cannot accurately hypothesize how that behavior was manipulated, or overcome by whoever took her.
So let's look at Beverly Potts. She was born on April 15th, 1941. Her parents, Robert and Elizabeth Potts, were of Hungarian descent, living on the west side of Cleveland. And we need to pause on that socioeconomic detail for a moment because it paints a picture of the community you're entering.
It really does. In the mid-20th century, Cleveland had one of the largest, most tightly knit Hungarian populations anywhere outside of Budapest.
Wow, outside of Budapest.
Yeah, it was massive. And these were neighborhoods built on really high internal trust. Everyone knew everyone. Families looked out for each other's children. It was a world where a locked front door was almost considered an insult to your neighbors.
Like you're accusing them of something just by locking up.
Exactly. And within that high-trust community, the Potts household had a very specific, really protective dynamic. So Robert and Elizabeth had an older daughter, Anita, in 1929. Then an entire 12 years go by. By the time Elizabeth discovers she is pregnant with Beverly, both she and Robert are 41 years old.
Which, in the context of 1941 maternal medicine, is fraught with anxiety.
Well, highly fraught. The infant mortality rates and the maternal risk factors for a woman over 40 in that era were really significant. This wasn't just a late-in-life baby. It was a medically precarious event.
People were probably talking about it, right?
There were. People in the neighborhood whispered about it, calling Beverly an oops baby or a surprise. But Elizabeth pushed back fiercely against that narrative. She insisted to anyone who would listen that Beverly was her miracle child.
And when you view a child as a miracle, you protect them like a priceless artifact.
You do. You hover.
Right. So by the summer of 1951, the Potts house on Linnet Avenue is this deeply stable, multi-generational home. You have Robert and Elizabeth, Elizabeth's cousin, 22-year-old Anita, who is back from college, and 10-year-old Beverly. It is an environment overflowing with supervision and affection.
And we also need to physically visualize Beverly here because her specific biology plays a crucial role in the witness sightings later on.
She was tall for her age, wasn't she?
Very. She was 10 years old, but she stood about 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 90 pounds. In 1951, that was quite tall. She easily could have passed for a 12-year-old. She had blue eyes, a dark blonde bob with short bangs, and silver fillings in her molars.
But the most critical physical identifier wasn't her face.
No, it was biomechanics.
The walk.
Precisely. Beverly had a highly distinctive, almost duck-like gait. Her toes pointed sharply outward when she walked.
That's such a specific detail to stand out.
Well, the human brain is actually wired to recognize gait and physical movement long before it processes facial features from a distance. I mean, you can often recognize a friend walking down the street a block away just by the rhythm of their shoulders, right?
Absolutely. Or the way they swing their arms.
Right. So Beverly's outward turning toes created this permanent, recognizable signature in how she moved through the world. Everyone who knew her recognized that walk.
But the physical description is only half the puzzle. We have to examine her personality, because this is where the conventional theories of child abduction just slam into a brick wall.
They really do. It's the most confounding part of the case.
Right, because Beverly was incredibly shy. She was famously obedient and cautious. I mean, the neighbors literally trusted this 10-year-old to walk their kindergartners to school because she was so incredibly responsible.
But her caution went far beyond typical obedience. She was acutely terrified of strange men.
And this is in the 50s, long before stranger danger was a thing.
Exactly. Long before the phrase became a cultural staple in the 1980s, Elizabeth Potts had drilled it into her daughter's mind. Elizabeth was constantly warning Beverly about unknown men, mysterious cars, and just the general dangers of the street.
And it wasn't just in one ear and out the other for Beverly. She internalized this fear completely.
Deeply. There was a documented incident where Beverly was walking in her own neighborhood, thought a man was following her, and she immediately broke into a dead sprint, running all the way home in an absolute panic.
She was just naturally on edge.
Very much so. She was so nervous around the opposite sex that she refused to even speak to the boys in her own classroom.
I really want to challenge the listener to think about the logistics of this. If you are an abductor, how do you capture a target whose entire nervous system is hardwired to flee at the first sign of an unfamiliar male?
You can't use the usual tricks.
Right. The traditional puppy in a box or want some candy lure simply does not work on a child like Beverly Potts. She would have bolted immediately.
Which leaves an abductor with only two real options: overwhelming immediate physical force, or completely bypassing her threat detection system somehow. Keep those two options in the forefront of your mind as we move into the environment where she vanished.
Right. So let's construct that scene. Halloran Park, Cleveland, August 1951. The park is hosting the show wagon.
And for those who don't know, what exactly is a show wagon?
Yeah, if you aren't familiar with mid-century Americana, a show wagon was a traveling community talent show. The parks department literally rolled a stage on wheels into the park. Local kids audition, and they put on this huge variety show with tap dancing, singing, instrumental performances.
Sounds incredibly wholesome.
It was highly anticipated community entertainment. It was the place to be.
But we must acknowledge the dual nature of Halloran Park itself. Because during the day, it was a 13-acre sunlit oasis stretching across 3 city blocks. But it was heavily populated with massive old-growth trees.
Which is great for shade, but
terrible for visibility. These beautiful, dense canopies of leaves had an unintended consequence. They completely swallowed the ambient light.
Right. So as soon as the sun went down, the park became a black hole. The street lights couldn't penetrate the leaves at all. And with that darkness came a shift in the park's ecosystem.
It became an environment really conducive to opportunistic crime. The local precincts had multiple reports in the preceding months of transient individuals sleeping on the benches, public intoxication, and far more concerningly, reports of physical assaults and groping occurring under the cover of those trees.
And the Potts' parents were well aware of this reputation. Beverly was strictly forbidden from being in Halloran Park after dark.
Didn't she just get in trouble for that?
She did. Just a few days prior, she had lost track of time, missed her evening curfew coming back from the park, and her mother grounded her. But the show wagon was an exception. It was the social event of the summer. Elizabeth relented and gave Beverly special permission to attend the Friday night performance.
So let's trace her steps on that Friday, August 24th. The evening begins entirely normally. Around 7 o'clock p.m., Beverly and her mother are washing the dinner dishes. Her parents and her sister settle into the living room to watch a baseball game on the television.
A very typical Friday night.
Right. Beverly walks next door, gets her best friend, Patsy Swing, and they hop on their bicycles for the short ride to the park. The distance is negligible, only about an eighth of a mile.
But when they arrive, they encounter a logistical nightmare. The turnout for the show wagon is massive.
How big of a crowd are we talking about here?
Over 1,500 people are jammed into this dark space. It is so tightly packed that the girls physically cannot maneuver their bicycles through the wall of adults.
So they have to pivot.
Exactly. They ride back home, drop their bikes on the front lawns, and walk back on foot.
And they re-enter the park around 10 minutes past 8 p.m. They manage to weave through the crowd and find a vantage point to watch the performers on the stage. But as the show progresses, the sun completely sets. The darkness we discussed takes over the park.
And Patsy, unlike Beverly, does not have special permission to stay out late. Patsy has a strict curfew of nightfall.
So she has to leave.
Yeah, at roughly 8:40 p.m., Patsy turns to Beverly and says they have to go. But Beverly digs her heels in. She negotiated this special permission, and she is determined to use it. She wants to see the finale.
They actually argue about it, don't they?
They do, briefly. Patsy refuses to break her curfew, so she leaves alone, walking back to her house just before 9 o'clock p.m. Beverly remains in the crowd.
Law enforcement interviewed Patsy extensively about this exact moment. Her final memory of Beverly was simply a visual. Beverly standing among the tall adults, her eyes completely glued to the dancers on the illuminated stage.
So the talent show concludes somewhere between 9:30 and 9:45 p.m. The organizers make an announcement, the stage lights are cut, and suddenly you have 1,500 people plunged into darkness.
All attempting to funnel out of the park simultaneously.
It is an absolute bottleneck of humanity. And it is within this chaotic mass exodus that we get our final and most critical verified sighting.
The witness is a 13-year-old boy named Fred Krause. And Fred's background is important here because he was a local newspaper delivery boy.
Right, which trains his eye.
Exactly. When you deliver papers, your brain becomes trained to passively recognize the faces and physical profiles of the people who live on your route, even if you don't know them personally. Fred was riding his bicycle through the park while his father watched the show.
As the mass of people surges toward the exits, Fred is trying to pedal his bike against the grain, or at least navigate the edges of the crowd. The visibility is virtually zero. He is nearing the northeast exit of the park, right near the intersection of West 117th Street and Linnet Avenue.
And then what happens?
Suddenly, a figure steps out of the shadows, walking on the grass alongside the paved path. Fred has to frantically ring the bell on his handlebars to avoid crashing into her.
And Fred is absolutely certain of who he almost hit. He couldn't see her face clearly in the dark, but he instantly recognized the biomechanical signature we discussed earlier.
The walk.
Yes, he saw the toes pointing sharply outward. He recognized the distinct, duck-like gait of the girl whose house he delivered papers to. It was Beverly.
I need to stop us here because the geography of this encounter is the most terrifying element of the entire case. Let's map this out for a second.
It's incredibly close to her house.
It is. Fred almost collides with Beverly at the corner of West 117th and Linnet Avenue. Linnet Avenue is Beverly's street. She's practically standing on her own block. From the patch of grass where Fred Krause rang his bicycle bell, Beverly was only about 150 feet away from the corner of her street.
That is 50 yards, half a football field.
Exactly. She is less than 60 seconds of walking time from her own front door.
It fundamentally alters the scope of the investigation. She didn't vanish in the deep woods. She vanished in the final handful of seconds before reaching the absolute safety of her home.
And I want to push back aggressively on the traditional theories that usually surround 1950s child abductions here. We always hear the narrative of the sinister stranger idling in a dark car, forcefully snatching a child off the sidewalk.
The classic boogeyman scenario.
Right. But think about the physical logistics required to pull that off in this specific 150-foot window. You have hundreds of pedestrians flooding that exact intersection, walking home from the concert. A stranger would have to be idling his engine in a sea of people, spot a 10-year-old girl in the pitch black, exit his vehicle, approach a child who is clinically terrified of unknown men, somehow subdue her before she screams or runs, force her into the car, and accelerate away.
All without a single person in that massive crowd hearing a struggle, noticing a struggle, or remembering a speeding car.
It defies logic.
You are identifying the exact logistical impossibility that has haunted detectives for decades. Predators who use vehicles as their primary tool for abduction seek isolation. They stalk solitary targets on empty streets to minimize the risk of intervention.
Because they don't want an audience.
Right. An intersection overflowing with families leaving a community event is a nightmare scenario for a forceful vehicular abduction. The risk of being seen, stopped, or having your license plate memorized is astronomical.
So if the logistics of a violent stranger abduction are that poor, what is the alternative?
The location and her psychological profile strongly suggest she was intercepted by someone who completely bypassed her threat detection system.
Yeah.
Someone who seamlessly blended into her expectation of safety just a stone's throw from her house.
So she goes completely off the radar after Fred rings his bell. It is now 10:30 p.m. Robert and Elizabeth Potts are sitting in their living room. The baseball game has been over for a while.
And that's when the panic sets in.
Yeah, the realization that Beverly is exceptionally late begins to curdle into real fear. Her sister, Anita, calls the Swings house next door. She asks if Patsy and Beverly stopped there. The Swings deliver the devastating news. Patsy has been home for over an hour and a half. She left Beverly at the park.
The reaction from Robert Potts is immediate. There is no waiting around. He rallies the neighbors, and they sprint the eighth of a mile to Howland Park.
But when they arrive, the illusion of the crowd is gone. The 1,500 people have dispersed. The stage is broken down. The park is an empty, silent, dark expanse.
They spend a frantic hour sweeping the grounds with flashlights, calling her name, and they find nothing. No dropped belongings, no signs of a struggle.
By midnight, they involve the Cleveland Police Department. And it's worth noting the friction here. The family had to call the precinct 3 separate times before officers finally arrived at the house.
A painful delay.
And the very first protocol the police follow is searching the immediate domestic environment.
Which is standard procedure, but agonizing for a terrified family. The police search the Potts household from the basement to the rafters twice, checking closets, crawl spaces, ensuring the child hasn't injured herself and hidden away somewhere inside.
Right. Once the home is cleared, they transition to a block-by-block grid search of the neighborhood, and finally, a coordinated sweep of the park.
And the physical search yields absolutely zero evidence.
Nothing. And this complete lack of clues creates an informational vacuum. Now, what happens in Cleveland over the next few weeks is a masterclass in how media sensationalism can completely sabotage an active police investigation.
The newspapers really ran with it.
Oh, the local papers, spearheaded by the Cleveland Press, whip the region into a state of sheer hysteria.
We really have to understand the media landscape of 1951. Missing child cases were not instantly broadcast to our cell phones via Amber Alerts. When a sensational story broke, evening newspapers aggressively weaponized it to drive daily circulation.
They were trying to sell papers?
Exactly. They didn't just report the facts, they serialized the tragedy. They printed every unverified rumor, every whisper from a neighbor, and every wild theory that crossed the city desk.
And what are the real-world mechanics of that kind of journalism? You turn a rescue mission into a grotesque public spectacle. Literally, thousands of people began swarming Linnet Avenue.
Just to look at the house.
Yes, they were parking their cars, standing on the Potts' front lawn, trampling the grass, just staring at the house like it was a tourist attraction. Elizabeth Potts is trapped inside, heavily sedated by her doctor because she is inconsolable, unable to eat, and she has to look through her curtains at crowds of strangers treating her missing daughter like a carnival exhibit.
The psychological toll on the family was horrific. But from an investigative standpoint, the media frenzy was catastrophic. Because the newspapers were publishing every agonizing detail, the police switchboards were paralyzed.
Too many tips.
Way too many. When you broadcast a mystery to millions of people, you invite the public to participate. The tip lines were flooded with thousands of useless sightings. People called from different states claiming they saw Beverly at diners, at gas stations, in the back of various cars.
It's the ultimate needle in a haystack problem, except the media is actively dumping thousands of fake needles into the pile every single day. The detectives are exhausted chasing ghosts.
And when the public gets impatient with the lack of police progress, they inevitably turn their suspicion onto the closest targets. They went after Robert Potts.
The father.
Yes. The character assassination of Robert Potts is a tragic study in groupthink. Robert worked the night shift as a stagehand. Because of his schedule, he wasn't visibly pacing the neighborhood during the day like the other fathers who had 9-to-5 jobs.
And people judged him for that.
Brutally. Neighbors perceived this absence as mysterious. They began feeding rumors to the eager reporters.
The rumors were vicious, too. They claimed he was a secret alcoholic. They claimed he had multiple DUIs, that he possessed a violent temper, that he was abusive to Elizabeth.
It escalated incredibly fast.
The papers actually dared to print speculation that Robert had murdered his own miracle baby.
All of which was empirically false. The police pulled Robert Potts' records. He didn't have a single DUI to his name. His entire criminal history consisted of one traffic ticket for an illegal left turn years earlier.
And he had a solid alibi.
An ironclad one. The police had immediately cleared all the adults in the home because they mutually alibied each other. They were all sitting in the same room watching the baseball game when Beverly vanished.
But the truth doesn't sell evening editions. The damage to the family's reputation was irreversible. The harassment escalated to the point where people were calling the Potts home at 2 o'clock in the morning, whispering cruelties into the phone.
That is just sick.
The family eventually had to permanently disconnect their telephone line just to survive the psychological assault.
The situation underscores how an investigation can rot from the outside in. With no crime scene, no physical evidence, a compromised family, and a timeline that abruptly terminates in the shadows of a park, the objective reality of the case just breaks down.
And when objective reality breaks down, speculation rushes in to fill the void. This is where we plunge into the internet theories, the historical rumors, and the cultural interpretations that have kept this exploration alive for over 70 years.
When you browse the true crime forums today, the debates almost always fracture into a few distinct camps.
The most prominent debate centers on the psychological hurdle we discussed at the beginning, the stranger versus the acquaintance.
Right. If the stranger abduction theory feels logistically impossible because of the crowd or hypervigilance, we naturally pivot to the acquaintance theory. This theory posits that the person who took her didn't have to force her because she already trusted them.
Consider the mechanics of how this would play out. A car slowly pulls up alongside the grass where Fred Krause just saw her. The window rolls down. The driver is a neighbor or a local shop owner or the father of a classmate.
Someone whose face belongs in her safe, high-trust world.
Exactly. They say, Beverly, your mother asked me to grab you on my way home, or it's too dark to walk, hop in and I'll drive you the rest of the block. Because she recognizes the face, her internal alarm never sounds. She willingly opens the door and gets in. No screams, no struggle, no drawn attention.
It is deeply logical. And her mother, Elizabeth, actually harbored a very specific, agonizing variation of this theory. Elizabeth was tortured by guilt. She had spent 10 years aggressively warning Beverly about strange men, but she realized with absolute horror that she had never explicitly warned Beverly to be terrified of strange women.
Wow, that's a chilling realization for a mother.
It is. Elizabeth went to her grave utterly convinced that a maternal figure had lured her daughter into the darkness.
And the female abductor theory is not just born of a mother's guilt. It is sustained by one of the most highly debated, controversial pieces of witness testimony in the entire case file.
Patsy's memory.
Yes, let's break down the delayed memory of Patsy Swing, because this detail sends internet sleuths down a massive rabbit hole. Remember, on the night of the disappearance, Patsy told the police her final memory was simply Beverly watching the stage. That was the official record.
But human memory is not a video recording. It is highly malleable.
As the months and eventually years dragged on, the police continuously circled back to Patsy. You have to imagine the intense psychological pressure on this young girl. The adults in her life, the intimidating detectives in suits, are constantly asking her to remember more. They are implicitly telling her that she holds the key to finding her best friend.
Under that immense pressure, Patsy's narrative evolves dramatically. Years later, she claims that when she turned back to look at Beverly one final time before leaving the park, Beverly wasn't alone.
What did she see? Or claim to see?
Patsy claims she saw a short, plump woman standing directly behind Beverly. And this woman had her hand resting affectionately, almost possessively, on Beverly's shoulder.
And some later iterations of this memory even introduce a third figure, suggesting the plump woman was holding the hand of a small child dressed in a talent show costume. It paints a picture of a really disarming motherly figure.
You can see exactly why the true crime community fixates on this. A maternal figure with a soft appearance and a child of her own in tow is the ultimate Trojan horse. She could bypass Beverly's defenses instantly.
She could say, "Sweetheart, my hands are full. Could you help me carry this box to my car over on 117th Street?" It completely explains the lack of a struggle.
It is a chillingly plausible scenario. However, forensic psychologists and seasoned investigators view this delayed memory with extreme skepticism.
Because of the timeline.
First, the delay itself is a massive red flag. Seeing an unknown woman physically touching your best friend is a highly salient detail. It is incredibly unlikely a child would forget to mention that during the initial frantic interrogations.
It honestly reeks of memory confabulation.
Precisely. Confabulation is not lying. It is the brain's unconscious attempt to fill in missing information to relieve stress. Patsy was traumatized. Her brain may have constructed the plump woman from a mosaic of other people she saw in the park that night to satisfy the relentless questioning of the adults.
And if you apply spatial logic to the memory.
Right. Patsy noted that she and Beverly were constantly standing on their tiptoes, straining to see over the tall adults in the crowd. Why would a short, plump woman choose to stand directly behind a remarkably tall 10-year-old where her view of the stage would be completely blocked?
Unless she wasn't there to watch the stage at all. She was there to watch Beverly.
Exactly. It implies predatory stalking. It is either a devastating clue or a tragic phantom created by a stressed child's mind. And because we cannot verify it, investigators inevitably turn their focus back to the physical tools of abduction, the vehicles.
Which brings us to the vehicular theories. In modern true crime culture, we have the phenomenon of the white van panic. Whenever a high-profile crime occurs today, community Facebook groups instantly flood with reports of a suspicious white utility van prowling the neighborhood. It is an urban legend that manifests in real time.
In 1951, the cultural equivalent of the white van was a battered black Dodge coupe.
The reports of suspicious vehicles in and around Halloran Park were numerous. Early in the evening, an adult witness named Mr. Varell reported seeing a dark coupe driven by a man in his 50s, aggressively circling the perimeter of the park, staring at young girls.
But the most persistent vehicle sighting involved a completely different demographic.
Teenagers, right?
Yes. Multiple attendees reported seeing two young men, estimated to be between 17 and 20 years old, one with dark wavy hair, the other blonde, loitering in the park and watching the young girls. And crucially, between 9:15 and 9:30 p.m., 3 independent witnesses claimed they saw a girl perfectly matching Beverly's description standing near a dark green or black 1937 or 1938 Dodge coupe.
And these witnesses placed those exact same 2 young men at the car, engaged in conversation with the girl. The witnesses specifically noted that the car was in terrible condition. It had a loud, smoking, defective muffler.
It's an incredibly specific detail. But note the gap in the testimony. They saw a conversation. Nobody actually saw the girl get into the car.
But the sighting of the smoking hot rod eventually mutated into one of the most famous local legends in Cleveland history, the Speed Queen theory.
To understand this theory, we have to define the slang of the era. In 1951, a speed queen was a localized term for a young woman who was heavily involved in the underground hot rod and street racing culture.
Less than a week after the disappearance, a rumor absolutely exploded through the teenage grapevine on the West Side. A local teenage speed queen named Barbara Saunders owned a souped-up hot rod. According to the rumor, she had loaned her car to her boyfriend's brother and his friends on the exact night of the show wagon.
The narrative of the rumor is highly specific. It claims that around 10 o'clock p.m., the boys called Barbara from a payphone in an absolute panic. They allegedly confessed that they had gotten into a terrible accident on West and 17th Street.
Striking a pedestrian.
Supposedly. They told her the car was hot, meaning compromised,
Yeah.
and they had abandoned it in a wooded ravine outside the city limits. The rumor goes on to state that when Barbara finally retrieved her hot rod the next morning, she discovered blood smeared across the front bumper and strands of cloth violently caught in the undercarriage.
The rumor was so pervasive that the Cleveland police had to treat it as a legitimate lead. They organized a massive physical excavation of the woods where the car was allegedly hidden. And they actually found something.
They found hair.
Right. They discovered several strands of blonde hair caught deep inside the metal hinge of the car's passenger door.
It sounds like the smoking gun. But when investigators subject the Speed Queen theory to structural stress testing, it completely falls apart. Consider the physics and the environment of the alleged accident. West 117th Street at 9:45 p.m. on the night of the show wagon was not a quiet country road.
No, it was packed.
It was a major thoroughfare completely clogged with hundreds of pedestrians crossing the street to go home.
I really want to emphasize the sheer absurdity of the physics here. The rumor suggests a loud, smoking, roaring hot rod struck a 90-pound child at high speed on a crowded street, and absolutely nobody witnessed the impact.
Makes no sense.
Nobody heard the screech of tires, the scream of the victim, or the sickening sound of metal hitting a body. And furthermore, we are supposed to believe these panicked teenagers managed to stop the car, pick up a bleeding, unconscious child, load her into the vehicle, and speed away without a single one of the hundreds of pedestrians noticing.
It is logistically impossible. An accident of that magnitude in that specific crowd density would have caused a riot, not a secret. The police ultimately concluded it was a morbid, sensationalized rumor manufactured by teenagers seeking proximity to the tragedy.
And what about the blonde hair found in the door hinge?
Well, chain of custody in 1950s forensic science was incredibly poor. The hairs were placed in an evidence envelope, misplaced in the archives for decades, and were never subjected to modern mitochondrial DNA testing.
So the localized rumors collapse under scrutiny. And when the local leads dry up, internet sleuths inevitably broaden their scope. They look outward, they look for the monsters we already know, the serial offenders.
There is a deep psychological comfort in connecting a cold case to a known, prolific serial killer.
Because it's tidy.
Exactly. It provides a neat narrative bow. It gives the community a specific face to hate, rather than grappling with the terrifying idea that an anonymous neighbor got away with murder.
And the face that constantly surfaces on Reddit threads regarding Beverly Potts is William Henry Redmond. Redmond is the dictionary definition of a boogeyman. He was a transient carnival worker. He operated Ferris wheels and traveled a circuit across the American Midwest, primarily through Ohio and Pennsylvania.
He had a documented history of severe, violent crimes against children that began when he himself was only 13 years old.
And Redmond is primarily discussed because of his direct, undeniable link to another tragedy, right?
Yes. In 1951, the exact same year Beverly vanished, an 8-year-old girl named Jane Marie Althoff disappeared from a carnival in Pennsylvania. Witnesses saw her whispering to the man operating the Ferris wheel.
Which was Redmond.
Right. Later that night, police found her body discarded in the back of an abandoned truck on the carnival grounds. The truck was covered in William Henry Redmond's fingerprints. He fled the state before authorities could apprehend him.
He lived as a fugitive for almost 4 decades. He wasn't captured until 1988, when police found him living quietly as a frail old man in Nebraska. While he was sitting in a jail cell awaiting trial for the Althoff murder, a cellmate claimed Redmond openly bragged about murdering at least 3 other little girls during his time on the road.
Because of his carnival route, armchair detectives have tried to retroactively map his movements, pinning him as a suspect in a half-dozen unsolved 1950s child disappearances.
And when Ohio authorities formally interviewed him in 1988, they point-blank asked him if he took Beverly Potts from Halloran Park.
Redmond's response was chilling. He refused to confirm it, but he explicitly refused to deny it. He simply smiled and declined to answer the question.
Which is pure gasoline for online theorists. But what is the actual objective reality of tying a traveling carnival worker to a community talent show in Cleveland?
The reality is anchored in a complete lack of corroborating evidence. Redmond makes for a terrifying story, but there is zero official documentation, no employment records, no traffic citations, no credible witness sightings, placing him anywhere near the state of Ohio in late August of 1951.
He's just a convenient phantom.
Yes. Furthermore, we must look at criminal profiling. Serial offenders typically operate within incredibly rigid victim profiles. Redmond's known and suspected victims were all significantly younger and smaller than Beverly. His oldest confirmed victim was 8,
And Beverly was 10, but she was almost 5 feet tall. She looked like a 12-year-old.
Exactly. She falls visibly outside his established predatory preference. Is it impossible that a transient killer deviated from his normal patterns because the opportunity presented itself? No. But from a strict investigative standpoint, without a timeline placing him at the scene, attributing this case to Redmond is an exercise in speculative fiction, not detective work.
Which leads us to the darkest, most psychologically twisted aspect of this entire 70-year saga, the hoaxes. Because a mystery of this magnitude acts like a magnet for a very specific type of pathology. It attracts people who possess an overwhelming need to insert themselves into the narrative, often inflicting profound cruelty on the surviving family.
The 1994 carpet letter is a perfect example of this.
Let's examine that. The discovery of this letter is a remarkable sequence of events. We are fast-forwarding 43 years after Beverly's disappearance. It is 1994. A crew is renovating an old house on Midvale Avenue, located on the west side of Cleveland.
They're tearing up the original flooring, right?
Yeah, exactly. Hidden beneath the old carpeting, they find a sealed envelope containing a letter written and dated in 1960. The contents of this letter are nothing short of explosive. It is written by a woman who claims that on the night of August 24, 1951, she walked down into the basement of her home and caught her husband red-handed.
Doing what?
She writes that her husband was actively disposing of the body of Beverly Potts by incinerating her remains in the home's coal furnace. The author claims she hid the letter under the floorboards as a secret time capsule, a testimony to a murder.
You can imagine the reaction of the cold case detectives. They finally have a written accusation tying a specific individual to the crime. They immediately pull property records for the Midvale house to identify the occupants in 1960.
Then they track down the woman who lived there. By 1994, she is an 83-year-old woman. Her husband, the man accused in the letter, had already died years earlier. The police confront her with this hidden letter, fully expecting to close the Beverly Potts file once and for all.
And how did she react?
She looks at the letter, acknowledges her own handwriting, and calmly tells the detectives that she made the entire thing up. It was a complete malicious fabrication.
The psychology behind her action is staggering.
It is. She explained to the police that back in 1960, she was going through a highly toxic, bitter divorce from her husband. She claimed he was emotionally and physically abusive. She wrote the letter and meticulously hid it beneath the floorboards as a deferred revenge fantasy.
That is unbelievably calculated.
Her goal was that decades later, long after she was gone, a stranger would find it, hand it to the authorities, and her hated ex-husband would be posthumously branded as a child-murdering monster.
The detectives interviewed her adult children, and they corroborated the environment. They admitted their father had a vicious temper, but they were adamant he was not a killer and had absolutely no connection to the Potts family.
It exposes a grim reality of how true crime intersects with human vindictiveness. This woman weaponized a community tragedy, using the agonizing mystery of a missing child as nothing more than a pawn in a domestic dispute. It is a profound lack of empathy for the Potts family.
But if you think the 1994 letter was cruel, it pales in comparison to the elaborate psychological warfare waged against the police in the year 2000.
Oh, the plain dealer letters?
Yes. This is the sequence of events that fundamentally divides investigators and true crime analysts to this very day. Beginning in the summer of 2000, an anonymous individual began sending a steady stream of letters to a specific reporter at the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper.
And law enforcement receives crank letters constantly, but these were different. They were highly structured, deeply disturbing, and presented a very specific narrative.
The author claimed to be an elderly man whose body was rapidly failing. He stated he was riddled with terminal cancer, advanced diabetes, and crippling arthritis. He claimed his physicians had given him less than a year to live.
And within these pages, he explicitly and graphically confessed to abducting, assaulting, and murdering Beverly Potts after the show wagon.
The forensics surrounding these letters are absolutely fascinating. The police didn't just read the words, they tore the physical evidence apart.
Let's talk about the mechanisms of how you analyze an anonymous letter. First, document examiners looked at the postage. The stamps used on these envelopes were not standard issue. They were a highly specific commemorative batch. Investigators cross-referenced postal distribution ledgers and discovered those exact stamps had been sold exclusively at only 2 specific bank branches in the Cleveland area almost a year prior.
It indicated the writer was local and meticulous. Then you have the handwriting analysis. This wasn't a static assessment. Because the letters arrived over the course of many months, forensic handwriting experts could track the evolution of the penmanship.
They saw it getting worse.
Exactly. They observed a distinct, progressive deterioration. The early letters were written with steady pressure. But as the months dragged on, the handwriting became visibly shakier. The spacing grew cramped. The pressure points on the paper became erratic.
It perfectly mirrored the biomechanical decline of an elderly person suffering from advanced terminal arthritis. It was either a genuine physical decline or an impossibly disciplined, brilliant forgery of physical illness.
And the most maddening part, the fingerprints, or rather the complete absence of them. There was not a single discernible fingerprint on any of the letters or the envelopes.
A layperson might assume this means the writer was a criminal mastermind wearing surgical gloves. But the fingerprint experts told the detectives to look at the biology of aging, right?
This is a crucial forensic mechanism. Fingerprints are left behind by the oils, sebum, and sweat secreted from the epidermal ridges of our fingers. As human beings age, our skin loses elasticity. The sebaceous glands significantly reduce their output.
The skin becomes dry and papery.
Right. It is a known forensic reality that elderly individuals frequently handle paper without leaving behind enough moisture or oil to create a viable latent print. The lack of fingerprints actually corroborated the writer's claim of old age.
There was one tiny slip-up, though. Crime lab technicians managed to isolate a microscopic trace of male DNA from the saliva used to seal the flap of the very first envelope. But the writer must have realized his vulnerability because every single subsequent envelope he mailed was sealed not with saliva, but with adhesive tape. He actively corrected his forensic mistake.
The author claimed he was currently in his 80s, which mathematically placed him in his 30s during the summer of 1951. He claimed he had drafted a comprehensive final confession detailing where the body was located and entrusted it to his lawyer, whom he distinctly referred to using female pronouns.
He stated this final document was to be opened and delivered to the police immediately upon his death. The correspondence reached a fever pitch when the Cleveland police decided to engage him directly through the media.
They published an open plea.
Yeah, they asked the newspaper to put it out there. The message was essentially, "We know you are old. We know you are dying. We are not going to drag an 80-year-old cancer patient into a concrete cell. You will be placed in a secure medical facility, but you must come forward and give the Potts family the location of their daughter."
And incredibly, the phantom writer responded. He sent a letter containing a promise that sent shockwaves through the cold case unit. He formally agreed to surrender. He promised he would walk into Halloran Park and turn himself in to the authorities on August 24th, 2001, the exact to the day 50th anniversary of the crime.
The police mobilized, they prepared plainclothes officers, they staked out the park, the anticipation was suffocating, but then on August 7th, just 2 weeks before the promised surrender, a final envelope arrives at the newspaper.
And what did it say?
The handwriting inside is catastrophic. It is barely legible, a series of weak, agonizing scribbles. The author states that his health has completely collapsed. He writes that his family is forcing him into an assisted living nursing home immediately, and because he will be under constant medical watch, he can no longer keep his appointment at Halloran Park.
He never showed up.
No. The letters stopped forever. He was never identified, so we have to rip this apart. Are we looking at the genuine, tortured final words of a dying predator seeking to balance his ledger before facing eternity? Or are we looking at the apex of true crime hoaxes executed by an obsessive sociopath?
Investigators remain deeply fractured over this. The skeptics point to glaring factual inaccuracies within the text. For instance, the writer claimed he stole a specific 1916 quarter from Beverly's pocket. But Elizabeth Potts adamantly testified that Beverly had left her coin purse on her dresser at home. She had absolutely no money on her person that night.
He also claimed he mailed a confession earlier, didn't he?
Yes. The writer claimed he mailed an anonymous confession to the county coroner back in 1967. The police tore the archives apart and found zero record of any such letter.
But then you talk to the detectives who actually worked the cold case desk, and they point out that the writer possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the West Side's hyper-local geography from 1951. He referenced sightlines, alleyways, and community details that only someone deeply embedded in that neighborhood at that specific time would know.
If we conclude it was a hoax, we have to acknowledge the chilling level of dedication required. The hoaxer would have had to research the stamp distribution. They would have had to train themselves to artificially fake the progressive biomechanical deterioration of arthritis in their handwriting over a 12-month period.
They would have had to maintain strict forensic discipline with the tape to avoid DNA transfer.
It represents a psychological game of cat and mouse that is almost as disturbing as the crime itself.
It is infuriating. The letters are a phantom lead, which forces us to zoom out. Let's look at the broader structural challenges of this investigation and examine why this case left such a massive cultural footprint. Why are we still analyzing the disappearance of Beverly Potts over 7 decades later?
The longevity of this case is rooted in the paradox we established in the opening minutes of our exploration today, the paradox of the crowd. Intuitively, we demand that an event with 1,500 people must be safe.
We think of a crowd as a shield.
But sociologically, a crowd is a moving blind spot. When a massive event concludes, particularly in the dark, the psychology of the attendees shifts into a deeply transient, self-centered state.
Everyone just wants to go home.
They're exhausted. They're mentally cataloging their belongings. They're calculating the fastest route to their vehicle. Their peripheral vision narrows. In that specific environment, if an adult male is walking away from the park holding the hand of a quiet child or walking closely beside her, the collective brain of the crowd instantly processes that visual data as a father guiding his daughter home.
It does not trigger an anomaly alert. The brain takes a shortcut. It sees an adult and a child and files it under normal.
Precisely. Unless the child is actively screaming, thrashing, and creating a violent auditory disruption, no one scrutinizes the dynamic. The noise of the crowd masks any quiet, coercive verbal exchange between the predator and the victim.
A successful abductor in that environment does not need to be a ninja. He does not need to be invisible. He merely needs to appear entirely ordinary for the 30 seconds it takes to walk from the edge of the crowd into the shadows.
And once that 30-second window closes and they enter the shadows, we have to contrast the investigative arsenal available in 1951 with the technology we take for granted today. I want to run a thought experiment. Let's transplant this exact crime to the modern era. How would the first 48 hours unfold if Beverly vanished from Halloran Park tonight?
The contrast is the difference between analog and digital reality. In 1951, policing was strictly manual. Detectives wore out the soles of their shoes knocking on doors. They relied on terrified witnesses attempting to pick faces out of physical lineups.
And the sex offender registries were completely different.
They were just paper files locked in filing cabinets, often years out of date, requiring manual sorting. When a psychic or a crank called in a tip about a buried body, the police had to literally commandeer backhoes and dig up municipal parks.
But if this happens today, that final 150-foot stretch of Linnet Avenue where Fred Krause saw her, it would be heavily saturated with high-definition Ring doorbell cameras. Every home would be passively recording the street. The municipal intersections would have traffic cameras.
Beyond the fixed cameras, consider the mobile surveillance network. Even if we assume a 10-year-old child doesn't have a smartphone kinging local cell towers, the 1,500 people in the crowd certainly do.
Absolutely. During the show wagon, hundreds of parents would have been recording the dancers on stage with their phones. In doing so, they would be inadvertently capturing gigabytes of high-resolution video of the crowd in the background.
Modern police would immediately crowdsource that footage. They would run facial recognition software. They could build a minute-by-minute digital timeline of exactly where Beverly was standing, who she spoke to, and crucially identified the face of every single adult male standing within a 10-foot radius of her during the finale.
And what about the physical evidence that was gathered and wasted? The blonde hairs found in the hinge of the hot rod? The microscopic trace of male DNA isolated from the saliva on the flap of the year 2000 plain dealer envelope?
Modern forensic genealogy would utterly dismantle the mystery of the letters. The crime lab would extract that trace DNA, run it through polymerase chain reaction to amplify the sample, and identify the single nucleotide polymorphisms, the SNPs.
They would upload that genetic profile into public genealogy databases like GED Match. They wouldn't need his fingerprints, and they wouldn't need him to be in the criminal system.
They would simply locate his third or fourth cousins through shared centimorgans of DNA. They would build a sprawling family tree backward, find the common ancestor, and trace the branches forward until they identified the single male living in Cleveland in the year 2000 who fit the age profile.
We see 50-year-old cold cases solved literally every week using this exact mechanism.
But because Beverly vanished in the analog darkness of 1951, those tools did not exist. The investigations stalled out. And the societal impact of that failure was seismic. True crime historian James Justin Badal coined a phrase to describe the aftermath of the Potts case. He called it the twilight of innocence.
It is a profound, incredibly accurate sociological assessment. We have to look at what America was selling itself in the post-World War II era. The country had survived the horrors of global conflict. The government was subsidizing the creation of the suburbs.
The implicit promise was this. If you moved out of the cramped, crime-ridden industrial cities, if you bought a detached house with a lawn on a quiet street like Linnet Avenue, you were purchasing immunity from the darkness. You were safe.
The psychological contract of the suburbs was that your children could ride their bicycles until the streetlights buzzed on, and they could walk to the community park in the dark without fear.
The Beverly Potts disappearance violently ruptured that psychological contract for the entire Midwest. It demonstrated in the most agonizingly public way possible that the monsters had migrated to the suburbs too.
The monsters weren't just lurking in faraway war zones or Skid Row alleys. The monster could be a man in a cardigan sitting on a park bench an eighth of a mile from your front door.
The geographical proximity is what truly terrified the public. The realization that a hyper-cautious, rule-following child could vanish into thin air a mere 150 feet from the sanctuary of her own home proved that no child was inherently safe anywhere, ever.
It forced a massive paradigm shift in American parenting. The invisible leash connecting parent to child got exponentially shorter. The implicit, assumed trust in neighbors began to erode, replaced by a low-level, constant suspicion.
It truly was the twilight of that specific mid-century innocence. And it explains why the case has maintained such a vice-like grip on the region's collective memory. It isn't just a historical footnote buried in the archives. It is an active, open wound.
To prove that point, as recently as 2015, the local Crime Stoppers organization suddenly issued a new $15,000 reward.
Why, after all that time?
Because they received an anonymous tip that seasoned investigators considered highly credible. The detectives went on television and publicly begged the tipster to call them back just to clarify one final, crucial detail.
But the phone never rang again. The silence resumed.
Which means the objective truth of what happened in the shadows of Halloran Park is still out there. It might exist as a deeply suppressed memory in the mind of an aging witness. It might be a written deathbed confession that a loyal family member refused to mail. Or it might be a forgotten physical artifact waiting in an attic.
The human brain despises an unsolved puzzle. We return to this case endlessly because it represents the ultimate terrifying variable. The idea that someone can beat the odds, beat the crowd, and step off the face of the earth.
It forces us to confront the limits of our own perception and the fragility of the systems we build to keep ourselves safe.
It is a terrifying reality. We assume that because we have logic, because we have expectations of community safety, and because we have decades of evolving forensic science, that the truth will always come to light. But Beverly's case proves that sometimes the perfect storm of environmental darkness, a massive distracting crowd, and a microscopic 30-second window of timing can completely, totally erase a human being.
It's sobering.
As we conclude our examination today, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. When we look at unsolved cold cases, we spend an enormous amount of time analyzing the predator. We search for the brilliant mastermind, the evil genius who planned the perfect crime and outsmarted the entire police force.
But what if there was no mastermind at Halloran Park?
Exactly. What if the true horror of that night isn't that an evil genius was hunting, but rather that a purely opportunistic, entirely ordinary predator simply got incredibly, inexplicably lucky? What if he made a split-second, impulsive decision in the dark, and the sheer chaos of the city's panic inadvertently swept away his tracks for him?
The terror of randomness is always more frightening than the terror of a plan.
It really is. It is something to think about the next time you find yourself walking through a massive crowd, assuming that all those thousands of eyes are keeping you safe. Next time, we travel to India to examine the Sheena Bora case, a family secret, a shocking murder, and a trial that captivated millions through television and social media.